Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about your school list. Now this is a topic that stresses so many people out. They wonder, how many schools should I apply to? How do I choose the right schools? So I'm hoping that some of this gives you at least a basis for picking the right school list. Now, one thing we're going to consider today is we're just going to talk about allopathic schools for a second. There are other videos where we talk about choosing osteopathic schools and even choosing international schools, but for now, let's just focus on allopathic or MD schools and the number of schools and how you should develop a school list. One of the first things that you need to consider when thinking about a school list is, number one, how competitive an applicant am I? If you have a 4.0 GPA and a 525 on the MCAT, obviously your school list can be a little bit more condensed than somebody who has a 3.6 GPA and a 510 on the MCAT. The more schools your application gets in front of, the better your chances of being accepted. But you have to be reasonable, and you can't go crazy with applying to all 120 medical schools or so. So if you're in the middle of the pack and you're trying to choose which schools and how many schools to apply to, there are a lot of important considerations, and we're going to talk about a few of them. Now, the first, when thinking about the school list, is public versus private. So you guys probably know that medical schools are broken down across the country into public medical schools and private medical schools. Examples of public medical schools: SUNY Downstate, SUNY Upstate, University of California, San Francisco, right? These are public schools. They're university systems, they're state university systems. Examples of private medical schools: well, Columbia, Harvard, Drexel, Creighton. These are all private medical schools. So as you think about your list, think about public versus private. And a great resource that I want pretty much everybody to think about getting is the Ansar. Oops, that's not working. That's a publication put out by the AAMC, and I think it's well worth the 20 to 50 bucks it costs, and you should all pay for this. It's really worth it. It goes through every medical school and gives you a lot of the data that we're going to be talking about right now. So public versus private, right? First, sort and filter. Now, private schools tend to be located in the Northeast. Well, I shouldn't say that. Private schools are located all over the place, across the country. And private schools typically put no emphasis on in-state residencies, whereas public schools put a lot of emphasis potentially on in-state residencies. So what you want to look at for a public school is in-state versus out-of-state. And the number of students, or the percentage of the incoming class that's in each of them. So if you look at a public university that's not your state, not in your state, and you look at their in-state acceptance percentage, or let's say their percentage of students in their incoming class that are coming from in-state, and you see that that number is 99%, and their out-of-state is 1%, you have almost no chance of getting into that school unless you're from in-state, right? There are schools like this. There are schools that are 100% in-state and 0% out-of-state. Conversely, if you see a school that's 50% in-state, 50% out-of-state, well, now maybe I can consider putting that school onto my school list at the end of the day. This number is huge. I want everybody to consider this when they think about what schools that are public schools out of their state of residence to apply to. Typically, what I tell my applicants is that if the number is 30% out of state, which means it's 70% in state, or less, you may not want to apply to that school, because that school is highly considering their in-state applicants, putting a lot of emphasis on their in-state applicants rather than their out-of-state applicants. Now, there are obviously exceptions to that rule, right? Let's say that you have a great connection at a particular school. You grew up in that state but now live elsewhere. Well, that's probably where they're drawing some of this 30% from. They're also drawing this 30% from exceptional candidates. So you take a school like University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Well, they have about, let's say, a 30 to 70 ratio here. but their 30 or their 20% of students that they're accepting from out of state are the same caliber of students that are being accepted to Harvard or Hopkins or Yale, right? So they're really looking to bring students into their school, but they're really looking at awesome candidates. So this is at least a first pass of what you should look at when you consider, should I apply to a public school that's not in my state of residence? Now, for most applicants, I tell them that you should apply to your own public schools anyway. So if you're from California, apply to all the California public schools. If you're from New York, apply to all the New York public schools. Now, there's some exceptions to this, right? UCSF in California is an extremely competitive medical school. So if you have no shot, maybe it's not worth applying. But in general, you should consider applying to all of your state schools. Now, when you look at private schools, they also will be broken down into in-state versus out-of-state, but what you'll see is that most of them are actually the other way, where almost 80% of students or so are coming from out-of-state, and only 20% of students are coming from in-state. Sometimes this is, 100% or close to it if you look at a place like George Washington or Georgetown, which DC is not a state, so you get 100%. But in general, basically, they are not looking at in-state versus out-of-state as a acceptance criteria. So private schools are where you're going to want to put the majority of your emphasis on your application for, and then some of the public schools which are accepting more students from out of state. Again, all these numbers are actually found on the Ansar. Now, the additional things to obviously consider are the GPA and MCAT scores. Now, every school publishes their mean as well as their 10th percentile and 90th percentile. For GPA, MCAT, Science GPA, total GPA, and MCAT. Now, these are great numbers for you to at least get an idea of, but there's so much that goes into this that I want you to be afraid of it in some ways. And why I say afraid of it. So what you're going to find is that there's going to be a school, let's just call it School X, that has a mean GPA of a 3.8 and a 10th to 90th percentile GPA of a 3.4 to a 4.0. Guesstimation on numbers here. What too many people do is if they have a 3.4 GPA, they say, wow, I'm within range of this school. I'm going to go ahead and apply. The reality is that the 10th percentile students, or the students that are matriculating at that school that are in the 10th percentile of their GPA, typically have something else phenomenal. Maybe they have an awesome MCAT score. Maybe they went to the Peace Corps for 2 years. Maybe they did a post-bac program. Maybe they're underrepresented minority, right? These are the different things that may go into somebody with a 3.4 getting accepted to our mythical School X. Same thing with MCAT score. Just because you're within the 10th percentile of what matriculants have, that doesn't mean a whole lot at the end of the day. You really should be looking at the mean as at least a standard. And obviously, if you're somebody who's, let's say, an overrepresented minority, then really you're gotta be towards that 90th percentile range to really have a good shot at that school. Now, along these lines, just because you have a 3.8 does not mean that our mythical School X is going to accept you. For every 3.8, and let's say their mean MCAT score is a 515, for every 3.8 and 515 that they're accepting, they are rejecting probably 100 applicants with those same exact numbers. That's obviously where the rest of your application comes in, right? What are you doing extracurricular-wise? How's your personal statement? How do you interview? This is just the start, but at least gives you some range to think about in terms of competitiveness levels. Now, I think a few additional important things to consider when you are applying to medical school are going to include, obviously, geographic locations. Where are you going to be happy? Where are you not going to be happy? Is it a rural versus an urban environment? All those things are great to consider as you're thinking about your school list, but there's a few additional caveats to that. The reality is that most medical schools around the country are much more similar than they are different. So this is not like college, where small liberal arts college in town Y was way different than huge state school, let's say University of Michigan, right? Way different. In reality, in medical school, a school like, let's take Drexel in Philadelphia, and a school like, let's take UT Southwestern in Texas or UCLA in California, most of these schools are relatively similar, right? They all have between 100 and 200 students or so. They all go through the same curriculum. Your second and your third and fourth year, are going to be in the hospital. They're all way more similar than they are different. And so that gets me to the point of being choosy or picky. The reality is you can't. This is the med school application process, and you really cannot be too choosy or too picky when it comes time to deciding where you want to go or even where you want to apply. Now, you have to keep your numbers somewhat within reason, and you can do that by kind of honing down here. But I don't want you to go choose or eliminate a school just because you think you're not going to like it. Again, the reality is most are more similar than different. Until you've really done your research and proved to yourself, don't do that. Now, the other thing that you guys may be used to from the college application process is breaking your schools up into target, reach, and safety, right? That's a classic breakup for college applications. For medical school, forget about it. There is no such thing as a safety school, period, end of story. Even applicants with phenomenal grades, phenomenal GPAs may not get in anywhere because there's really no such thing as a safety school. Sure, there's some target schools, and what I consider target schools are basically schools that are within your reach, right? Within your your academic profile. Those are your target schools, and then throwing a few reach schools on there. I'm all for reaching for the stars. Go for it. Now, we haven't really talked about the total number of schools you're going to apply to. And this is really, I go back to being dependent on a lot of different factors, right? What kind of applicant are you? How good is your GPA? How good is your MCAT score? Is this your second or third time applying? Well, then I want you to apply to a whole lot more schools. Is this your first time applying and you have some family considerations that you can only stay in the area? Well, then maybe you can apply to a few less schools. For most applicants, I consider around 20 schools to be the starting point. I've seen a lot of applicants go through this process. I've seen a lot of applicants who don't get in, mostly because they haven't applied to enough schools. There's a lot of luck involved in this process. Even great applicants to only target schools may not get in. Remember, schools have a lot of admissions criteria. They have a lot of things that they're looking at. They also don't necessarily want to definitively interview somebody. Let's say their mean is a 3.8 and 515. They may not want to waste an interview slot on a 4.0 and a 525. And so they may not even call you for an interview, and that's super frustrating for students, but that is what happens. So I really feel like applying to more schools is better. Obviously, it costs more money, it's a lot of work, and you cannot apply to 120 schools. That's way too many. But starting at the 20 range, I think is a good number to at least start at for most applicants. And it goes up from there. There are applicants that may want to apply to 40 to 45 schools to have the best shot at getting in. There are other applicants who may only need to apply to 15 for whatever reason. But let's use 20 as at least a good starting point. So I've talked a lot about sort of numbers and situations for you looking at a school list. You notice I didn't talk a lot about curriculum. I didn't talk a lot about opportunities. And I go back to saying that most medical schools actually have very similar opportunities, very similar curriculums. If you go to a USMLE school, you're going to be able to match into a residency that you want for the vast, vast majority of students. So getting in anywhere is huge. And remember, you can't be picky. So Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a basis on some of the numbers to look for in the Ansar as you search and try to figure out, okay, how am I going to whittle down this school list to maybe around 20, 30, maybe 40 schools, depending on who you are.